Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Nick Marshall. I'm the Manager of Exhibitions and Programs at the George Eastman Museum. Before I hand it over to Lisa, I'd like to recognize the NEH for their support of this virtual program. I'd also like to give thanks to our members for their continued support of all we do at the museum. Today's program is part of our monthly Focus 45 series that features museum staff, students, and researchers giving a behind-the-scenes look at a variety of different projects going on across the museum. For today's talk, curator in charge of the Department of Photography, Lisa Hostetler, will discuss the photographs on view in our newest installation in the History of Photography Gallery, commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment's ratification. As some of you may know, we opened to the public a few weeks ago, and we've loved having our guests back. Everyone has been really great about following our new protocols for safety, including wearing a mask at all times while in the museum, socially distancing, and purchasing tickets ahead of time through our website. If you're not comfortable with coming into the museum yet, we have posted this exhibition online as a virtual gallery experience. We'll post links to the new visiting procedures and the virtual gallery in the chat function. And while I'm on the topic of the chat function, if you have any questions about today's talk, please do not send them through the chat icon at the bottom. There is another icon that says Q&A. If you click on that, you'll be able to ask a question at any time throughout the talk. When Lisa is done presenting, I will go over as many of the questions that we have time for. The program will last about an hour total, including the Q&A. We will be recording today's presentation, so if you'd like to go back and watch or share it with a friend, it will be posted to our YouTube channel in probably about a week. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Lisa Hostetler.
Thank you, Nick, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining me for this overview of the current installation of photographs in the George Eastman Museum's Permanent Collection Gallery. The selection of photographs in the gallery changes at regular intervals in order to ensure that we preserve them for as long as possible, since by nature photographs are composed of light-sensitive materials. One advantage of this preservation necessity is the continual opportunity to refresh the contents of the space. This allows the museum to display a broad range of works from its photography collection, which contains more than 400,000 objects. The responsibility for curating each group of photographs changes with every installment, but the chronological framework remains in place, so you can always see new things within a consistent historical arc. I curated this current installation together with my colleague Jamie Allen, who is the Stephen B. and Janice G. Ashley Associate Curator in the Photography Department, and 4 students from the Eastman Museum University of Rochester's Master's Program in Photographic Preservation and Collections Management. Their names are Rebecca Gourevitch, Forrest Soper, Swann Vitale, and Xiaochun Wang. We made our selections with a mind to commemorating the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted American women the right to vote. The amendment was first introduced to Congress in 1878, but it didn't pass the House and Senate until June 4th, 1919. Even with Congress's approval, it couldn't go into effect until 3/4 of US states ratified it. There were 48 states in 1920, so 36 ratifications were needed. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify on August 18th, 1920, and Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby certified the amendment as an official component of the United States Constitution on August 26, 1920. Although the centennial inspired our choices, the group of photographs that we selected expands beyond this event. Collectively, the display examines how photography has portrayed and continues to shape perceptions of women and feminist movements since the mid-1800s. In determining the final checklist, we wanted to make sure that we included not only famous women associated with the fight for women's suffrage and subsequent feminist movements, but also ordinary women who lived before, during, and after these legal and social changes occurred. For it is only by interweaving the famous with the everyday that we gain real social and historical understanding. I'll start with portraits of several notable women who fought for human rights when photography was in its infancy. This is a portrait of Dorothea Linddix, who was an early American mental health care advocate. She was one of the first medical practitioners to promote a belief in the humanity of people with mental illness and rejected the scientific consensus of the time that insanity was incurable. Her efforts led to the establishment of 32 asylums throughout the United States. The portrait was made by the Boston daguerreotype studio of Southworth and Hawes, who operated one of the most famous 19th century photographic studios from 1843 to 1863. Southworth and Hawes are celebrated for their artistic sensibility and facility with a medium that was difficult to control, especially when the subject was impatient. Nancy Niles Southworth, the sister of Albert Sands Southworth and eventual wife of Josiah Hawes, wrote about Dix's sitting in a letter now located in the Southworth and Hawes studio archive in the Eastman Museum's library. She wrote, quote, "Miss Dix sat for her daguerreotype a few days ago. She was too much in haste and fidgety and serious to get a fine picture." These card-mounted portraits of a triumvirate of notable activists for women's rights are displayed together in the gallery. The format, a photographic print, adhered to a card that was typically stamped with the name and or logo of the professional photography studio that created the image, was available in standard sizes such as the carte de visite and cabinet card, both seen here. By the mid-1800s, collecting such portraits of politicians, actors, and other famous figures had become a popular pastime. Often, people kept these in albums alongside photographs of their own family members and friends. The prevalence of this trend inspired abolitionist and activist Sojourner Truth to leverage its potential for spreading her social message. She copyrighted her own image and then sold the photographs to support speaking tours on which she addressed the abolition of slavery and advocated for women's rights. The slogan she had printed on the mounts, which is hard to see, but it's right here, said, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." And this made it clear that the sales of her image directly helped her cause. Sojourner Truth was committed to ensuring that Black people and women, all women, gained their civil rights simultaneously. And this distinguished her views from those of well-known contemporaries such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who argued that women's suffrage should take priority in the fight for equality. Rochester, New York native Susan B. Anthony is perhaps the most famous advocate for women's suffrage. She devoted her life to social activism, fighting for the abolition of slavery, for temperance, and of course for women's rights to vote. In 1878, she and Stanton convinced California Senator Aaron Sargent to introduce to Congress a constitutional amendment that granted women their right to vote. 42 years later, this became the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution. Lucretia Mott came to the women's suffrage cause through her commitment to abolishing slavery. A woman who refused to conform to prevailing notions of proper feminine behavior, she was barred from speaking at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in 1840, which brought her into contact with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The two joined forces to organize the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. Mott fought ardently for both women's rights and Black people's rights throughout her life. My laser pointer won't let me change the slide. There, okay. This next portrait depicts a star of the next generation of suffragists. and it was made by a woman who supported the cause. The subject, Enola Pankhurst, was known as England's most famous suffragette. Her conventional beauty ran counter to contemporaneous suffragist stereotypes, and she was not afraid to respond to violence with violence when her demonstrations were attacked. She traveled to the United States for speaking tours in 1909, 1911, and 1913. It may have been during one of these visits that she sat for this portrait by Alice Boughton. Boughton, like her friend and mentor Gertrude Casavere, operated a prominent portrait studio in New York that catered to well-known artists and writers such as Eugene O'Neill and Albert Pinkham Ryder. She was also a member of the Photo Secession, an organization formed to promote the practice of photography as an art form. The natural elegance that this portrait conveys and the nuanced range of tones in the dark areas of the platinum print testified about Boughton's skill. Now I'd like to circle back around to the early days of photography to consider some of the lesser known people who existed alongside the more famous names that we've looked at so far. If I can get the laser pointer to stop. Okay. This scene depicting Firth of Forth fishwives, that's kind of a tongue twister, Firth of Forth fishwives, in the New Haven district of Edinburgh, dates from around 1845 and gives us a sense of daily life there, even if it has been artfully arranged for the camera. At the time this photograph was made, the New Haven community was known for a cooperative work philosophy that placed relatively equal value on women's and men's labor. The photograph is by Hill and Adamson, who joined forces to create studies for a large history painting commemorating the founding of the Free Church of Scotland. David Octavius Hill was commissioned to paint it, and he sought out Robert Adamson, who had mastered the new medium of paper photography, to make photographs of real-life scenes in order to inform his work. The photographs supersede their original purpose, however, and today read as artistic documents of New Haven inhabitants in the middle of the 19th century. The industrial cousins of Hill and Adamson's fishwives might be the textile workers in this tintype. Women made up a large percentage of the labor force in 19th century textile factories, and unlike the relative parity found in the New Haven fishing community, women typically earned lower wages than men. On the other hand, employment outside the home offered women some financial independence, and working together in often difficult conditions encouraged a sense of solidarity among working women. Their fight to reform working conditions often dovetailed with the struggle for women's suffrage at the same time. This photograph brings the idea of community among working women to my mind as I noticed the male supervisor isolated from the group in the right foreground of the image. On March 3rd, 1913, Rosalie Jones, known as General Jones to her suffragette followers who were known as Pilgrims, arrived in Washington, D.C. for a women's suffrage procession to the Capitol. It was the day before President Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated and the end of a 240-mile, 17-day hike from New York City to Washington, D.C., known as the Votes for Women Pilgrimage. And you can see that in the sign in the upper left of at the top left of this slide. The prominent automobile in the middle photograph is significant not only because automobiles became an emblem of modern female mobility and independence, but because of its driver. She is Olive Schultz, the first woman taxi driver in New York. The inclusion of the car is notable as well because the firm that made and distributed photographs of the hike, Spooner and Wells, specialized in photographing automobile racing in the early 20th century. I found, in preparing for this talk, I found some footage of the Suffrage March that Rosalie Jones led. And this comes from when it was passing through Newark, and women joined the march to DC there. So I thought I would share with you some of this footage. So there's Rosalie Jones. That a police escort, apparently. And I was watching this with some colleagues yesterday, and we remarked on how many men seem to be in this women's march. Okay. Okay. This next item is a photo postcard, one of several photo drawing caricatures that Waldemar Thode made of fellow members of the Photographers Association of America. The subject is Catherine Jameson, who is a leader of the Women's Federation of the Photographers Association of America, which was founded by Mary Carnell in Rochester, New York in 1909. The Federation's purpose was to, quote, found a camaraderie among the women photographers, its object being mutual help, the interchange of artistic, technical, and business ideas, comparative exhibitions, and the united efforts of its members to improve themselves in the art of photography. Jameson was president of the Federation in 1913, and her Votes for Women sign marks her as a suffragette. The National American Woman Suffrage Association ran a popular postcard campaign in 1910 to raise awareness and funds for their cause, and this Jameson-specific photo version riffs on the notoriety of that campaign, and you're seeing an example of that on the right of this slide. This photograph depicts not a suffragette, but another popular character from the same period, the Kodak Girl. There was no single Kodak Girl. She was a persona rather than a person, and Kodak ran annual contests asking for photographs depicting her. In addition to the prestige of being selected, photographers who won often had their images used in Kodak advertising campaigns. This was a winning entry from William Shul Ellis, who ran a successful photography studio in Philadelphia. There, he created a number of photographs that Eastman Kodak Company used in its print advertisements. His images depict women fashionably dressed with a Kodak camera prominently displayed, as in this example, or women using cameras to document participation in the latest lifestyle trends, such as driving an automobile or boarding a plane for a jaunt to the coast. The so-called Kodak Girl created an enduring link between women, photography, and the accelerated pace of modern life. This particular print was attached to a folio with a congratulatory note from Kodak Vice President L.B. Jones that reads, quote, I don't know whether you made the Kodak Girl famous or whether she made you famous, but this I do know. When we used an Ellis picture, we could always point to it with pride. There are several other works in the museum's collection from the studio of William Shul Ellis, including portraits, advertising photographs, and wedding pictures. Although primarily known as a professional photographer, the Ellis materials preserved at the museum indicate his interest in pictorialism, as his signature, which you can see here, and blind stamp have a arts and craft aesthetic that is reminiscent of Edward Steichen's pictorialist era signatures and Gertrude Casebeer's. He also created portraits of Sadakichi Hartman, who was an art critic and member of the Stieglitz Circle. Get rid of this laser pointer. This unconventional portrait is by Alfred Stieglitz, the leader of the group of avant-garde photographers that I just mentioned. In the years between World War I and II, he led a shift away from pictorialism among photographers in America toward a more streamlined aesthetic based on the abstract forms of modernism. This coincided with an equally radical transformation in women's fashion, such as shorter hemlines and the bob hairstyle characteristic of the new woman. The two trends come together in this portrait of Dorothy True, a friend of Stieglitz's wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, whose style and personality matched the flapper moniker. Her showing a well-heeled leg in this portrait was daring for the time, and Stieglitz's focus on it as an emblem of her character was an equivalent artistic statement. Madame Yvonne was another colorful woman with an outsized personality who made her mark between the wars, not in America, but across the Atlantic in London. Yvonne FallonMiddleton was the daughter of Frederick Cumbers, a director of Johnston and Cumbers, which manufactured printing inks. Madame Yvonne, her professional sobriquet, grew up wealthy and upper middle class. She was fiercely independent and decidedly unconventional, one consequence being that she attended and was expelled from a number of boarding schools. Sent to Paris with her sister for finishing school and to study at the Sorbonne, she discovered the suffragette movement and became a dedicated advocate. In fact, the fight for women's rights was directly responsible for Madame Yvonne's career in photography. An ad for a photographer's apprentice in the Suffragette magazine led her to work for the London portrait studio of Lally Charles. She left Charles's studio in 1914 and established her own studio with funds she received from her father for her 21st birthday. Society portraits were her specialty, but in the mid-1920s, she began creating photographs for advertising clients as well. In 1921, she gave an address to the Congress of the Professional Photographers Association, the first woman to do so. Her talk was titled, "Photographic Portraiture from a Women's Point of View," and she asserted that women were better suited than men to portrait photography because of their innate qualities of sympathy, patience, and intuition. The text of her lecture caused great controversy, especially after it was published in the British Journal of Photography. But her expertise with the proprietary color photographic process 5X, which you can see in the crisp rendering of the brightly hued dress that this model wears, earned her international accolades throughout the interwar years. 5X is a process that was introduced in 1928 and was available until 1939. It was a variation of the Carbro process that used cellophane instead of traditional carbon tissues. And that allowed for more flexibility when you needed to register the three tissues together to get the full color print. Margaret Burke White was another woman who made a name for herself as a photographer around the same time. She started her career making photographs of American industry for Fortune magazine, which hired her as its first staff photographer in 1929. She was also the only woman among the first staff photographers for Life magazine, and her photograph was published on that magazine's first cover in 1936. In 1930, Burke White became the first foreign photographer allowed into the Soviet Union, where she traveled on assignment to document Stalin's 5-year plan. Contemporaneous Soviet rhetoric celebrated working men and women as equal beneficiaries of their ideology, and the natural rapport between the woman and the machine in this photograph seems to underscore that point. The Soviets admired the tempo and productivity of Henry Ford's automobile factories and modeled their own industrial plants on Ford's operations. In fact, it was likely Burke White's photographs of a Ford plant that account for her invitation to photograph in the USSR. Back in the USA during World War II, women joined the factory workforce in increasing numbers. With most working class men serving in the military and a critical need to manufacture supplies and materiel for the war effort, the federal government ran advertising campaigns, such as the famous Rosie the Riveter one, to encourage women to take up factory jobs. Between 1940 and 1945, 5 million women entered the workforce. Photographic badges such as these are remnants of this shift on the home front of the war. The employers in this array of badges made the following products during wartime. The Springfield Armory made weapons. The Continental Can Company manufactured aircraft parts and bombs. General Electric created aircraft superchargers. And the Kaiser Company and the Marine Ship Corporation produced naval vessels for the military. Oops. This portrait of Katherine Hepburn turns our attention to a celebrity who kept women's issues in the public eye after the 19th Amendment was passed and before the second wave of feminism in the 1960s. Hepburn advocated for women's rights on and off the screen, fighting for equal pay in the entertainment industry and fiercely challenging gender stereotypes. She prioritized her career over marriage and insisted on wearing pants at a time when most women were expected to wear skirts and high heels. In one Hollywood legend, her movie studio arranged to steal her trousers from her trailer on set in an effort to force her into dresses and skirts. It didn't work. Hepburn paraded around the studio in her underwear until her slacks were returned. Although many of Hepburn's films contain feminist themes, her most radically feminist films can be divided into 3 categories. Those in which communities of women are central to the plot, those in which Hepburn portrays strong female characters from literature and history, and those films which directly address women's issues. As an aside, Hepburn came by her feminism honestly. Her mother was a committed activist who fought for women's suffrage, access to birth control, and better working conditions for women. The dramatic lighting in this image was a hallmark of photographer George Hurrell, whose glamorous headshots of the Hollywood glitterati have been credited with transforming stars into icons. The FBI's wanted poster for Angela Davis could be understood as the polar opposite of Hurrell's glamour photos, but they may have been almost as widely distributed. The events that led to the FBI's search for Davis centered on her public statements about events in 1970 at Soledad State Prison, which was notorious for its deplorable conditions and inhumane treatment of its prisoners, especially Black men. When a white prison guard was found dead after killing 3 African-American inmates in the Soledad prison yard, George Jackson, Cleta Drongo, and John Clutchette were accused of the murder. The case became a cause célèbre of the civil rights movement, and Angela Davis took a lead role in defending the 3 men, known as the Soledad Brothers. The case came to a head when Jackson's brother held a judge, district attorney, and 3 jury members hostage outside a Marin County courtroom. 4 people died in the resulting shootout, and Davis was charged with interstate flight, murder, and kidnapping for her alleged involvement. A jury eventually found her not guilty of those charges. It was while she was in hiding after the courtroom shootout that her wanted poster appeared. Its wide distribution prompted supporters of Davis and her cause to post bills supporting her to counter the negative image the wanted poster projected. Davis was already a public figure before the Soledad case. She was an outspoken UCLA professor and a prominent figure in the Black Panther Party. Today, she continues her work as an advocate and activist in the modern movement for women's rights, civil rights, and prison reform. The second feminist wave coincided with the civil rights era, and they shared many supporters and leading figures. Shirley Chisholm was among them, seen third from the left in the top photograph. She was the first Black woman in Congress, where she introduced landmark legislation on gender equality and civil rights. Chisholm is with Bella Abzug, standing, Gloria Steinem, just below Abzug, and Betty Friedan at the far right. They're at the press conference to announce the organization of the National Women's Political Caucus, which recruited and sponsored women to run for political office in local and national government. For those who are too young to remember these other bold-faced names with chiseled, or for those who want a refresher, Bella Abzug was a lawyer and member of the House of Representatives from 1970 to 1976, whose feisty statements in favor of women's political leadership inspired a generation. Gloria Steinem is a journalist, activist, and co-founder of Ms. Magazine, and Betty Friedan was the author of The Feminine Mystique, a popular book in its day that's become a mainstay of the feminist canon. A poignant description of post-war women's isolation and intellectual dissatisfaction. It served as a call to arms for many American housewives. All four of these women are heroines of the women's liberation movement, which fought for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, the cause of the demonstration you see in the image on the right. And both photographs are press prints, which are glossy 8x10 black and whites used to create lithographic plates for mass printing before the digital age. Photo agencies sent such prints with their typed captions either printed into the image, as you see in the photograph on the left, and that caption would have been cropped out in the pre-press process to make the lithographic plate, or they were attached to the photograph, like the one for the protest picture here. And this is the caption that the Associated Press sent with it. You can see the abbreviations at the bottom, which are indicating which outlets should receive it. So I'm picking up the New York World Service is the first one. I also see Newsweek at the bottom. The legacy of women's leadership in movements to advance not only gender equality, but also human rights and social justice is not limited to the United States. This photograph draws attention to the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which fought to improve the lives of indigenous communities in Mexico. The Zapatista placed women's issues at the center of their cause, calling out domestic violence and forced marriages while advocating for education and better health care. The mask over this woman's face makes her unidentifiable, a practical strategy to avoid retaliation by authorities that has ideological resonance as well, since Zapatista valued the principle of collective living. Antonio Wallace Turok is a Mexican-American from Mexico City who moved to San Cristobal de las Casas, a colonial town in the Chiapas Highlands, at a young age. Turok was living in San Cristobal de las Casas on January 1st, 1994, the day of the Zapatistas uprising pictured here. The two Afghan women in this image are being treated for burns they inflicted on themselves as an act of protest against abuse and oppression by men. With the rise of the Taliban just a few years into the war on terror, women's rights and autonomy reversed course several times as the balance of power shifted in the region. Stephanie Sinclair's photography, centers on issues of gender and women's rights around the world. Her most recognized body of work is Too Young to Wed, which documents the practice of forcing young girls into marriage. The fight for women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendment is still continuing, as demonstrated in the January 2017 Women's March. The event, seen here in a photograph by Larry Fink, was organized to support gender equality as well as reproductive, civil, and human rights, and drew between 3.3 and 4.6 million people across the nation, with approximately 575,000 individuals marching in Washington, D.C. Larry Fink is a celebrated documentary photographer who has explored America's tight-knit social communities, from beatniks to fashionistas, and from lumberjacks to boxers. He's always been drawn to the culture of politics and was active in documenting the 2016 presidential campaigns on both sides of the aisle. The moral and philosophical questions that drive movements in support of women's rights have been and continue to be fertile ground for artists. While Chisholm and Abzug were fighting rhetorical battles in the political arena, Marian Fowler made her everyday experiences as an ordinary woman the subject of her art. Her series, Hey Baby, Take My Picture, is a playful rant on a custom as familiar to women today as it was 50 years ago. The experience of being catcalled while moving through an urban environment. These 6 pictures are from a group of 51 that she made when she determined to photograph every man who asked her to take his picture while she walked New York City streets with her camera. In her statement about the series, she wrote, quote, "Only men and boys have asked, never women. I'm told, though, that young women often ask men to photograph them." After taking a photograph, Fowler would offer to make a print for her subject. Out of the 51 men photographed, only 1 took Fowler up on her offer. In this work, Carrie Mae Weems calls out a sharper and more insidious form of subjugation based on her own experience. A Black woman and one of today's leading contemporary artists, Weems remembers being called, quote, "Redbone Girl" as a child. This led her to examine and make art that highlights the role of colloquial language in shaping one's identity and sense of self. Her series, Colored People, focuses on words used to describe shades of Blackness both within and outside communities of color. Each work is composed of monochromatic color images paired with words that can have multiple applications. Here, the word colored implies both its derogatory connotation and the chemical photographic process that she used to cast the images in magenta tones. The received ideas that shape our understanding of ourselves and others are in many ways fantasies, figments of our collective imagination. The subject of fantasies, particularly those about women's sexuality, animates this photograph by artist Lisa Hostetler. The worn, faded carpet suggests the former presence of human bodies in this strip club. Details like this rarely register in the fantasies on which such places depend, but they are common experiences for the real people who work in and patronize these establishments. There are several additional photographs in this installation that I didn't discuss here, but they're equally effective representations of the ways in which women, their ideas, and society's notions about women impact our cultural landscape. I hope that you'll take a look at them. In person is best, of course, with a mask and pre-purchase ticket. But of course, you can also see the online version of the show that Nick mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, which we're able to make available thanks to a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. So thanks, and I hope you enjoy the installation.
Thanks, Lisa. That was really great. Some questions coming in. I'm gonna try and get through as many of them as we can. We've got a little bit of time here. So first question that came in, do we know who the Kodak girls were?
Some, because they were not all the same and people sent them in from everywhere, sometimes yes, sometimes no. I did do some research to try to find out who exactly that Kodak Girl was, and I wasn't able to uncover the model for Ellis for that picture, but that's not to say it's not find outable. It just hasn't been discovered yet.
Okay. Does the collection also contain photos from the U.S. post-World War II occupation of Japan depicting General MacArthur's women's emancipation policy?
Not that I was able to discover. However, I'm thinking in particular of a collection of press prints that are on several subjects and have not been fully processed yet. So it's possible that the collection does contain them, but they haven't been cataloged yet.
Let's see here. Are there daguerreotypes or ambrotypes of individual activist women? If so, who, where taken, photographer? Any comments?
Well, some of the pictures I showed at the beginning would fall into that category. So the Dix picture is not of a person who fought specifically for women's rights, but she did fight for human rights. I'd say in terms of it's easier to look for particular people within our collection than to look. You sort of have to know who you're looking for. So there are certainly more leaders of women's rights organizations than I showed you today, or that are in the installation at the museum in our collection. And we do have an online database that can be searched, and especially if you're looking for someone in particular, that is the easiest type of search. But you can also do searches based on years or based on mediums that would help you do that research.
Great, thank you. And just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. Was the 1913 newsreel of the Washington March done by Universal Studios?
No, well, that wasn't credited. It was put together by, I think it was a home movie, but it was saved by the creative CBGP, which is, I'm going to forget what that stands for. But they preserved that from what my understanding from what I found was from a home movie.
Okay.
I see Dale has a question.
I'm going to try and work around my cat here. Were there any photographers, presumably female, who were embedded with Abzug, Steinem, or any of those others? It seems like they would have some sort of staff photographer by that point.
I imagine that they did. The picture that I showed is from the AP. So they were covering like the press conference that was happening at this convention about for women's rights. And it was around the time that the National Organization of Women was also founded. But particularly Bella Abzug would have had a staff photographer, and Shirley Chisholm, since they were in the government and public figures. And Gloria Steinem, I'm sure, worked with a photographer as well. Betty Friedan probably didn't have a staff photographer. She was, and she may have, I mean, she was a really famous author. but I'm not sure that she had a specific photographer that she worked with.
The question, this is a good one that I'm actually very curious about. Does any image in the installation particularly resonate with you?
Sorry, I was trying to find this other slide. That's a hard question. I have to say that this is going to be uncharacteristic for me, but the one that sort of caught my imagination was that AP photograph that I just mentioned with Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem and Shirley Chisholm and Bella Abzug, because those were names that were always on the news when I was a kid. And it was sort of like a instant flashback when I saw that picture. And then it also reminded me of when I read The Feminine Mystique, which had sort of not been on my mind until I came across that picture. And then I remembered how it had affected me when I was I think I was in college when I read that book, and realized the difference between American housewives in the 1950s, the lives of American housewives in the 1950s, and how different things were in the 70s and 80s when I was living, and I hadn't quite realized the sort of trapped American housewife thing. So anyway, seeing that picture made me think about the kind of atmosphere of the 1970s, and it resonated with me.
Great. There's a question about the Stieglitz image of the well-heeled leg. The platform the leg is on appears to be resting on what appears to be photographic mat. Do you know if this is the case?
Let's see, let's go back to that. Stieglitz. So Stieglitz made this probably somewhere in his gallery, because he often used an American Place and 291 as, I think at this point it was an American Place, to make his pictures. So, but it does look like mat board there, like a cut mat board. And like, I'm sure he was sort of presenting whatever he had at hand to bounce the light as much as he wanted, but would have appreciated the geometric shape and straight edges of the mat board lying around, and the fact that it does look like mat board is what suggests to me that it was probably at the gallery, where they would have prepared and framed works for exhibition.
Interesting. All right, we've got another question that just came in from Tabitha. Hi, Tabitha.
Hi, Tabitha.
The images of the parade at the beginning of the presentation showed women in hooded robes. Is that typical of outdoor coats of the time, or were they dressing for the public or the camera? For me, the capes made the female marchers look like witches.
That was, and their outfits were like a thing that was talked about in the press. So like there were a couple of things. So they had these outfits sort of like to push, they were, I don't know, flouting that idea of women suffragists as these sort of witchy people. And they would sort of take on these negative connotations and then turn them into something that identified them and made them well known. So that cape was one thing, and then also the hats that they wore, and especially Rosalie Jones, that white one that comes up like that's. Oh, I should just find it. So this is the hood, but underneath this hat here was sort of like her signature. Somebody is also in the chat noting that it was pretty cold and they needed they needed some extra outerwear for that hike.
Yeah. Okay. If there aren't any other questions, we can wrap up a little early.
Let's see, I'm gonna go back to the
So, you know, one of the things that, Lisa, I always find interesting about this is, and that, you know, when you see the exhibition space in person, you know, it's not a large gallery space, and it's always so interesting to me to see the way that you can kind of pare down, you know, the history of photography into, you know, 30 something images. So I always, it's always great to see how, you know, creative you can get with covering a lot of ground with, and, you know, 150 year
yeah.
time.
Well, that's why it's important that we change it regularly, because there's not a lot of, we can't really tell the whole history, but we can sort of, you know, have a series of excerpts, and then if you see a whole bunch of them over an extended period of time, you get a better sense of the full history. But yeah, and it's fun to go through the collection and be able to show photographs that might have a hard time finding a context in a huge show about one particular topic. And this allows us to share some of those outlier pictures that we have in the collection.
Yeah. So a question did come in. Just as a reminder, this is being recorded, and we will be posting it on our YouTube channel. So if you want to check back there in about a week, it should be posted, and feel free to share the link with everybody. And as I mentioned, we are open to the public with some levels of restrictions for safety measures. And I can't emphasize enough that it is it's such an amazing experience to see these objects in person if you have the ability to. It's great to be able to see them in a presentation like this, but I think Lisa will agree with me. The preferred method is, of course, to see the actual prints themselves as works of art that they are. So
definitely.
So thank you all for joining us, and look out for the link. And our next webinar is going to be next Friday, same time, 1 o'clock. The curator of our technology department, Todd Gustafson, is going to be chatting about some of the cameras and technology that are currently in the History of Photography gallery. So if you're interested in that, you can find that information on our website and sign up for that, and it is free, and hope to see you there. Take care, everybody.